Old England had some truly disgusting food. We're talking eyeballs, lungs, and cow udders. Here's what vanished from British tables: lamprey pie. Lamprey pie was considered a delicacy for centuries, particularly among royalty. Henry I supposedly died from eating too many lampreys in 1135, though the exact cause gets debated. What's certain is that these jawless, eel-like creatures were baked whole into pastry with wine and spices, and yes, their own blood was used to thicken the filling. The texture is what made it so off-putting by modern standards. Lampreys have no bones, just cartilage, and when cooked they turn gelatinous. The blood gave the filling a dark, almost black color that contemporary descriptions sometimes compared to thick gravy. Elizabeth II was gifted a lamprey pie for her Diamond Jubilee in 2012, made using the traditional medieval recipe. Most reports focused on how it looked rather than how it tasted. They're still eaten in some parts of Europe, but in England the tradition died out almost completely by the mid-20th century. The blood, apparently, tastes metallic. Boiled calf's head. Boiled calf's head disappeared from British tables without much ceremony. Once it fell out of favor, nobody rushed to defend it. Old preparation notes contradict each other constantly. Some mention splitting it lengthwise, others don't. A few insist the skin stayed on because it held the shape together, though other sources claim removing it early made the whole thing easier. Even basic timings vary. What never changes is the list of parts served: cheeks, tongue, the eye sitting there like a leftover decision nobody thought to remove. Most descriptions read like someone explaining a tool rather than a meal. They focus on the way the flesh loosens from the bone, how the head needs to be handled gently so it doesn't collapse in the pot. The jelly that forms around the skull gets mentioned often, usually without enthusiasm. Victorian cookbooks treated it as practical rather than appetizing, cheap protein that filled a table when better cuts weren't affordable. Some butchers in the north still kept calves' heads on display through the 1960s, though mostly for pet food by then. Brawn, head cheese. Brawn wasn't some forgotten medieval oddity, it was sold in British butchers well into the 1980s. The pig's head was boiled for hours, sometimes up to 6, until the collagen broke down and turned the cooking liquid into natural gelatin. Once cooled, the whole thing set into a firm loaf that could be sliced thin and served cold. Ears, snout, cheeks, tongue, all of it went in. Some recipes added vinegar or spices, but the base method stayed consistent across regions. Boil, press, set. The name head cheese stuck in America. Britain called it brawn. What's odd is how specific the cuts were meant to be. Victorian manuals recommend slicing it no thicker than 1/4 inch, as if precision mattered when you were eating a pig's face held together by its own jelly. Mrs. Beeton's 1861 cookbook lists it under economical dishes, which tells you everything about its social standing. Some families in Yorkshire still make it for Christmas, though most use a mould now instead of a cloth. Production dropped sharply after BSE regulations tightened controls on offal in the 1990s. Humble pie. An humble pie gets painted as this quaint peasant dish, but that's not quite right. It disappeared because nobody wanted to admit they were eating it in the first place. The filling, deer heart, liver, kidneys, sometimes intestines, came from the leftover bits after a hunt, the parts the nobility didn't bother with. Servants got the humbles. That's where eating humble pie comes from, though the spelling shifted over time and muddied the connection. The pie itself was functional. Dark meat, heavy seasoning to cover the iron taste of organ meat, pastry thick enough to hold everything together without leaking. Some recipes mention adding sweat or ale to the mix, but accounts vary enough that it's hard to pin down a standard version. Medieval cookbooks list it alongside other made dishes, which basically meant anything assembled from scraps. By the 18th century, it had mostly vanished from written records. Venison became less common outside aristocratic estates. Offal itself started losing favor as butchery improved and people could afford to be pickier. The phrase survived in the language long after the actual pies stopped being made. Cow heel soup. How did something this cheap end up feeding half of industrial England? Cow heel soup was everywhere in the 19th century. Street vendors sold it by the cup, families stretched a single hoof across 3 meals, and workhouse kitchens served it in enormous batches because the gelatin made thin broth feel substantial. The hooves simmered for hours, sometimes overnight. You'd get this thick, almost gluey liquid that set solid when it cooled. People added onions, turnips, whatever was around. The texture put some off, but hunger has a way of adjusting taste. Charles Dickens mentioned it once in passing, though he never specified whether he'd actually tried it himself. Victorian cookbooks treat it as baseline sustenance, the kind of thing you made when meat was impossible and bones were all you had. Street sellers in London carried it in metal urns strapped to their backs, ladling it out steaming in winter. The last recorded heel soup vendor in Birmingham operated until 1927, though records after that get spotty. By the 1950s, tinned oxtail had taken over most of the cheap soup market. Sheep's trotters. The skin had to come off first. That was the part most modern accounts skip. You'd scald the trotters in boiling water, scrape off the wool and outer layer, then split them down the middle to expose the bone. Some cooks left them whole. Either way, the stewing took hours. 3 minimum, sometimes 5 if the feet were older. The gelatin leached out slowly, thickening the liquid until it coated the back of a spoon. Sheep trotters had almost no meat. You were eating connective tissue, fat, and whatever clung to the tiny bones between the joints. The appeal was purely textural and economic. They cost nearly nothing and turned water into something that felt like a meal. Street vendors in Scotland sold them hot from metal pots well into the early 1900s. Workers bought them on lunch breaks, ate them standing up, tossed the bones in the gutter. Municipal records from Glasgow mention complaints about the bones piling up near certain corners, though enforcement was patchy. The practice stopped. Calf's foot. Jelly Victorian invalids were fed this constantly, which tells you something about how unpleasant being sick must have been. The jelly itself came from boiling calves' feet, sometimes for 8 hours, until the collagen broke down completely and the liquid turned clear. Once strained and cooled, it set into something translucent, wobbly, and almost tasteless unless you added lemon or sugar. The texture sat somewhere between firm and slippery, holding its shape on a spoon but collapsing the moment you bit into it. What made it strange wasn't the process. Gelatin desserts were common enough. It was that this one never stopped reminding you where it came from. You could see through it. The clarity felt clinical. Some recipes mention skimming the fat repeatedly to get that glass-like finish, which sounds... Actually, the smell during preparation was apparently worse than anything the finished product tasted like, a persistent boiled bones scent that lingered in kitchens for hours. By the 1920s, powdered gelatin had replaced the feet entirely. The homemade version stopped. Boiled sheep brains. The Edwardians treated brains like a casual breakfast option, which seems impossible until you see the actual recipes. Boiled sheep brains were served on toast, sometimes in white sauce, and the texture was described as custard-like in nearly every cookbook that bothered to mention them. They were cheap. That's the main reason they existed at all. A sheep's brain cost pennies and could be prepared in under 20 minutes if you knew what you were doing. Blanch them briefly to firm up the membrane, peel it off carefully so the brain stayed intact. Then poach them gently in salted water until they turned opaque and held together just enough to slice. Some households mashed them into scrambled eggs, others fried them in butter after boiling, which added a crispy edge to something that otherwise had no texture to speak of. A few gentlemen's clubs in London kept them on the menu through the 1950s, though by then it was more tradition than genuine preference. BSE regulations in the 1980s effectively ended commercial brain sales in Britain, though the dish had already been fading for decades before that. Fish head pie. Fish head pie worked on the same logic as crab. You went for the cheeks and ignored the rest. The heads, usually from large cod or haddock, were packed under pastry with onions, herbs, and sometimes eggs, then baked until the flesh pulled away from the bone easily. The cheeks were the prize, small nuggets of sweet meat that tasted better than most of the fillet. Everything else, eyes, skull, cartilage, stayed in the pie because removing it beforehand was more trouble than it was worth. Cornish fishing communities made them regularly through the 1800s. Waste wasn't an option when your income depended on selling the good cuts. The heads came free or near free from the docks, so the pie cost almost nothing to make and fed a family for a day. By the early 1900s, though, fish became cheaper overall and people stopped tolerating bones in their meals. The last traditional recipes appeared in regional cookbooks from the 1920s, then just stopped. Was it squeamishness or economics that finally killed it, or both at once? Giblet pie. Giblet pie was never meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to use up what would otherwise get thrown to the dogs. The logistics of poultry butchering in the 18th and 19th centuries meant that for every dozen chickens sold whole, you accumulated necks, hearts, gizzards, and livers faster than anyone knew what to do with them. So they got chopped into chunks, mixed with gravy or stock, sealed under pastry, and baked into something dense and chewy that filled bellies without costing anything beyond the flour for the crust. The gizzards were the real challenge because they needed longer cooking than the livers, which meant timing the pie so nothing turned to mush while the tougher bits stayed rubbery, and most cooks just split the difference and accepted that the texture would be uneven. Some recipes mention adding hard-boiled eggs to bulk it out further, though that seems like overkill when the whole point was stretching scraps. Market stalls in London sold individual slices wrapped in paper through the 1890s. Chickens became cheaper. The pies disappeared within a generation. Savoury ducks. And savoury ducks had absolutely nothing to do with actual ducks, which seems worth clearing up immediately. They were meatballs, pig liver, heart, kidneys, whatever offal the butcher had left over, mixed with fat, breadcrumbs, and sometimes blood, then shaped into lumps and boiled like dumplings. The name apparently came from their shape, though that explanation never quite holds up when you see period illustrations showing them as irregular blobs rather than anything resembling poultry. They appeared in English cookbooks as early as the 1730s, with Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery listing them under made dishes, and by the 1800s they'd become standard fare in working-class kitchens across the Midlands and North, particularly in areas where pork butchery was common and wasting offal was unthinkable. The fat kept them moist. The blood gave them colour. The iron-heavy taste divided opinions sharply. By 1920, references had mostly disappeared from printed recipes. Offal fell out of favour. The names stuck around longer than the food itself. Collared pig's head. The skin had to stay intact in one piece. That was the entire point of the technique, and if it tore during preparation, the whole thing collapsed into a mess that couldn't be rolled properly, which is why butchers who specialized in collaring charged extra for doing it correctly. The process involved stripping the meat and skin from the skull as a single sheet, laying it flat, seasoning it heavily with salt and spices, then rolling it tightly and tying it with string before boiling it for hours until the collagen set the whole cylinder into something firm enough to slice cold. Sources disagree on whether the ears stayed attached. Some period recipes insist they were essential for flavor, others treat them as optional or even distracting, and a few make no mention of them at all, which suggests the method varied more than cookbooks admitted. The Romans did something similar with pork, though whether that influenced English technique or just happened to parallel it is unclear. What's consistent across accounts is that collared pig's head was considered respectable enough for middle-class tables through the Victorian era, sliced thin and served with mustard. The last roll, tied and ready. Pickled ox tongue. The brine had to cover it completely, otherwise patches turned brown and spoiled. An ox tongue sat in salt water for 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes longer if the weather stayed cool, absorbing enough sodium to turn the meat grey and rubbery throughout. Once pulled from the brine, it was boiled for hours, 3 minimum, until the outer skin peeled away easily, revealing the pale, firm flesh underneath that could be sliced thin and eaten cold. The texture was dense, almost waxy. It held its shape on the plate without drooping, which made it practical for buffets and cold spreads where appearance mattered as much as taste. Some versions added peppercorns or bay leaves to the brine, though the salt did most of the work. Interestingly, ox tongue was one of the few preserved meats that remained popular across class lines well into the 20th century, showing up in both working-class sandwiches and middle-class dinner parties, without much adjustment to the preparation. By the 1970s, pre-sliced vacuum-packed versions had replaced the whole tongue in most shops. Eel pie. People assume eel pie was some niche delicacy, but it was ordinary working-class food before beef became cheap enough to replace it entirely. Eels were everywhere. Rivers, canals, coastal waters, you could catch them year-round, and they stayed alive in barrels for days, which meant fishmongers could sell them fresh even in cities miles from the coast. And the price stayed low enough that a pie made from chopped eel, stock, and pastry cost less than most meat alternatives through the 1700s and well into the 1800s. The texture put some people off. Dense, slightly oily, with small bones you either picked out or learned to chew carefully, but hunger adjusts preferences quickly, and eel pie filled tables across London, particularly in the East End where the Thames still had decent eel populations before industrial pollution wiped them out by the late Victorian period. Pie and mash shops kept serving it into the 20th century, though by then it had started shifting toward nostalgic novelty rather than necessity, and jellied eels, sold cold from street stalls, outlasted the pies by decades, sold in small white bowls with a splash of vinegar on top. Lights pudding, lung pudding. The Smithfield Market records from 1847 list lungs, called lights because they weighed so little, at less than a penny per pound, which makes them the cheapest organ meat available by a significant margin. That price is what drove lights pudding into existence. Pig or sheep lungs, chopped fine, mixed with sweet, onions, oatmeal and whatever spices you had, then stuffed into cloth and boiled until it set into a dense, grey, spongy mass. The texture was the main problem. Lungs are full of tiny air pockets, so even after hours of boiling the pudding stayed slightly porous, almost foam-like in places, with an odd springiness that put most people off immediately. The preparation took planning. Lungs had to be trimmed carefully, the windpipe removed, the membranes peeled away, or the whole thing turned bitter. Mrs. Beeton's 1861 cookbook includes a recipe but warns it's not suited to delicate stomachs. Strange thing is, some regional variations in Yorkshire apparently used beef lights instead, which cost more and defeated the entire point of the dish being cheap. Potted pigeon. Potted pigeon existed because refrigeration didn't. The pigeons, usually wood pigeons or rock doves, were roasted until the meat pulled away easily, then shredded and packed tightly into earthenware pots before being sealed under a thick layer of melted butter or lard that solidified as it cooled. Once sealed, the meat could last weeks, sometimes months, depending on how cool and dry the storage space was. What's odd is how common this was, not just in rural areas where pigeons were plentiful, but in cities too, where pigeon lofts on rooftops provided a steady supply of cheap protein. Some sources mention spicing the meat heavily, mace, pepper, cloves, while others insist the fat alone was enough to preserve flavor, though both camps agree the texture turned slightly grainy after a few days under the fat. The Victorians treated potted meats as a sign of household competence, something a good cook always kept on hand. Pigeons were easier to catch than rabbits. By the 1920s, tinned meat had replaced most potted preparations entirely. The earthenware pots themselves became collectibles decades later. Roast dormouse, medieval imported Roman tradition. Roast dormouse never took hold in England the way it did in Rome, and honestly that's a shame because the preparation was genuinely clever. The practice disappeared by the late medieval period, pushed out by changing tastes, and the simple fact that dormice weren't easy to farm in Britain's climate. The Romans had entire systems for fattening them in clay jars called gleraria, feeding them chestnuts and acorns until they were plump enough to roast, and a few English nobles tried replicating this in the 13th and 14th centuries after reading classical texts or hearing about it from travelers. Some recipes survive in manuscript collections. Dormice stuffed with pork, forcemeat and honey, roasted on skewers, but the instructions are vague enough that it's unclear how often anyone actually made them. The animals themselves are small. You'd need dozens to feed a household. One medieval bestiary describes their flesh as delicate, though whether that's first-hand knowledge or copied from Pliny is anyone's guess. The Tudors ignored dormice entirely. By the 1600s, references had stopped appearing in English cookbooks altogether. Sheep's head. Sheep's head broth worked on the same principle as French pot-au-feu, except nobody romanticizes it because it involved staring at a skull floating in your dinner. It stayed on tables in Scotland and northern England well into the 1900s because it made economic sense, not because anyone particularly enjoyed it. The head simmered for hours, 3 minimum, sometimes 6, until the cheeks turned tender and the tongue peeled easily from the bone. Some cooks left the brain in. Others removed it partway through and served it separately. Period recipes contradict each other constantly. One says to split the head before cooking. Another insists keeping it whole preserves flavor. A third mentions scorching off the wool first, which sounds obvious but apparently needed stating. The broth itself was rich, gelatinous, dark. You'd ladle it over barley or oats to stretch it further, and the meat, what little there was, got picked off at the table. Agricultural workers in the borders ate it weekly through the 1800s. By 1950, most butchers had stopped stocking whole heads. Souse, pickled pig's feet and ears. The vinegar had to be strong enough to sting if you got it on a cut, which tells you something about the preservation method right there. Souse was made by packing pig's feet and ears into crocks, covering them completely with spiced vinegar brine, usually malt vinegar with peppercorns, bay leaves and sometimes cloves. Then leaving them to sit for at least a week, sometimes 2, until the collagen from the trotters and cartilage from the ears broke down just enough to turn the whole thing jelly-like and chewy without falling apart completely. The feet required splitting lengthwise before brining, otherwise the thick skin wouldn't absorb the vinegar properly and you'd end up with spoiled meat in the center, while the outside pickled fine. Exact timings varied. Some sources say 7 days minimum, others push it to 14. The ears were simpler. They pickled faster because they were thinner, and the cartilage held its shape better, which made them easier to slice cold and serve alongside the trotters, though by that point the vinegar had usually turned cloudy and needed straining, or maybe it didn't, and people just ate it that way. Pig fry. Lights, spleen, and offal fry up. Bacon grease was considered too valuable to waste on cheap cuts, which is why pig fry was usually cooked in its own fat, rendered from the offal itself. Pig fry wasn't bacon. It was lungs, spleen, heart, liver scraps, whatever the butcher couldn't sell separately, all chopped and fried together in one chaotic pan. The lungs were the worst part. They spat, they popped. The air pockets inside expanded when heated and burst unpredictably, sending tiny flecks of grease across the stove and sometimes onto whoever was cooking, which made the whole process slightly dangerous if you leaned too close. The smell filled the house, sharp, organ-heavy. Some families ate it weekly because it was cheap and filled bellies, but nobody pretended it was enjoyable. The texture varied wildly depending on which organs ended up in the mix. Liver turned grainy, spleen stayed chewy, heart held together better than the rest. Slaughterhouse reforms in the mid-20th century meant offal had to be handled separately. Pig fry stopped being sold as a mixed batch. Boiled beef udder. The Victorians had a word for nearly every cut of meat, but udder still appeared in butcher ledgers under euphemisms like elder or neat's elder to avoid putting customers off. Boiled beef udder disappeared because nobody defended it once better cuts became affordable. The udder was sliced into chunks and boiled for hours, sometimes 3, sometimes 5, until it turned rubbery and pale grey. The texture, spongy, flabby. Period cookbooks describe it as milky in flavour, which sounds almost appealing until you realise they meant it literally. The tissue retained traces of whatever the cow had been producing before slaughter, and no amount of boiling fully removed that faint dairy taste. It showed up in workhouse menus, in cheap lodging houses. Anywhere cost mattered more than palatability. Some cooks tried disguising it by adding onions or mustard sauce, but the consistency gave it away immediately. Too soft to chew properly, too dense to swallow easily. By the early 1900s, most butchers had stopped stocking it. The last recorded sale in a London market was 1923, sold for soup stock.